With Gordo Cooper's successful day-long flight, almost a day and a half, Mercury was complete and had ended on a triumphant note. And now NASA moved on to try and meet Kennedy's challenge to land humans on the moon before the end of the decade. Of course, everyone wondered what the Soviet Union was up to. It had been almost a year since their Vostok double flight of Vostok 3 and 4. And it was not until June of 1963 that what turned out to be the final two Vostok missions were launched. But they certainly made quite an impact, because one of the craft, Vostok 5, was flown by cosmonaut Valery Bakovsky, but Vostok 6, his companion craft, which was launched a couple days later on June 16, 1963, was piloted by the very first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova. And here is some footage of Tereshkova getting into her spacesuit on that day of June 16th. And you can see she's coming out to the launch pad, and now she's about to get in the spacecraft, getting some last words of advice, perhaps. Here is the R-7 rocket getting up to full thrust and lifting off and heading for orbit. And here is Tereshkova from the cabin of Vostok 6 on live television, or television anyway, wasn't usually released live. And then after landing, she is surrounded by a crowd of curious onlookers inspecting her spacecraft. Well, that flight made an enormous impact in the West. And you can see here the spread in Life magazine, and it's kind of interesting to note that they have a picture of her getting her hair done on the left. I guess it was 1963 after all. So they did have that sort of thing. But notice the confident picture of her in her space helmet, and this really made a great impression on Americans, and in particular, that issue of Life magazine revealed for the first time to most Americans the names of 13 women who had been undergoing some of the same physical tests given to the Mercury astronauts before they were selected for NASA. Now, these women were not connected with NASA in any way. This was not an official astronaut selection process. What it was a privately funded study that was put together by Randy Lovelace, an aerospace medicine doctor who was curious to know how women would hold up to those tests. He had helped develop many of the screening tests used for the original 7 astronauts. And the women went through various stages of very grueling tests, the same kinds of things that the Mercury astronauts had been subjected to, and quite a few of them did as well, if not better, than some of the men had done. And if it were purely a question of medical qualifications, they would surely have held their own in an astronaut selection. But the problem was that they were not military jet pilots. Of course, at that time, the military was not accepting women as jet pilots. These women who went through the Lovelace tests had, many of them had quite a number of hours in propeller aircraft and were quite experienced as pilots of prop aircraft, but had not flown jets, and certainly not high-performance jets of the kind that the Mercury astronauts had flown. Interesting thing was that Jerry Cobb, who you see on the right there, who was sort of the the unofficial leader of the group. They were not really a cohesive group. They rarely met together, or they may not have ever seen each other all in one room during that testing period. But more recently, they become known as the Mercury 13. But anyway, Jerry Cobb pushed very hard for NASA to consider them for astronaut selection. She wrote to President Kennedy, met with Vice President Johnson, and in the summer of 1963, she was able to get a congressional hearing in the subcommittee of the Science and Technology Appropriations Committee, or actually it was in July of '62, excuse me. They had public hearings, House Committee on Science and Astronautics, and they made their case that they deserved to be considered as astronauts. Unfortunately, Scott Carpenter and John Glenn were there, having just flown in orbit, and they said that it was impossible for them to be considered because they lacked the jet experience, and other officials and the astronauts too, I think, actually made the statement that it would be harmful to the progress of trying to land on the moon before the end of the decade if NASA were to make arrangements to accept these women. So their ambitions were frustrated. Today there's been quite a number of books and articles written about them. There's certainly more information available on them. And in any case, NASA had its hands full with new groups of astronauts. They selected in 1962 a new group of astronauts, 9 test pilots, and in this picture I'm going to read them off for you. The front row from left to right: Pete Conrad, Frank Borman, Neil Armstrong, John Young, and then in the back row, Elliot C., Jim McDivitt, Jim Lovell, Ed White, and Tom Stafford. Then in 1963, they took 14 more astronauts. This was the first time that a test pilot degree was not required. You just had to have military high-performance jet experience. And so here in this one picture, the front row from left to right: Buzz Aldrin, Bill Anders, Charlie Bassett. In the back row, Mike Collins, Walt Cunningham, Don Isley, and Ted Freeman. And here's the rest of the Group 3 astronauts. Front row from left to right: Alan Bean, Gene Cernan, Roger Chaffee. And in the back row, Dick Gordon, Rusty Schweickart, Dave Scott, and C.C. Williams. And these were the guys who would eventually be in the running to fly to the moon. That was the long road ahead of them and ahead of NASA. This is Andy Chaikin, and that's week 3. We'll see you next week.